So it is cohesive content curation. This is your Learning Leader's Guide. Here we brought together two of the more interesting contemporary cliches on this slide: keep calm and curate. So we're going to try to keep calm and curate in the L&D space today. So today we're going to talk first about the whole concept of curation and how we can customize it towards L&D. I want to build on the other key word in the title of this presentation too and talk about cohesion, and see curation as an opportunity for further cohesion in the work we do by talking about the core of the learning organization. Sort of an interesting concept and a bit mysterious, so we'll look at it from all kinds of different ways. And in fact, what we're going to do is move in a rather rapid way through a series of exhibits. So you can imagine these as curated exhibits brought to you for your own experience and enlightenment that have to do with different ways of looking at the core through culture, experience, ecosystem, as a system of managed change. So curation, it's everywhere. This image is actually from the Starbucks near my house, and I've discovered traveling around it seems to be omnipresent, maybe at your Starbucks also. So they no longer are just providing snacks for us, they're actually curating them, carefully selecting them, understanding our tastes, and also providing, it's sort of true. I mean, they provide some really interesting snacks too that you may never have heard of, but seems like something you'd like. So it's well done, I'm sure. So in some ways, curation is sort of getting trivialized. It's moving far away from its base into all kinds of other parts of the culture, but it's also getting sort of aggrandized. Here we have several books actually that talk about the importance of curation, the concept of curation in the sharing economy. Steve Rosenbaum here says that basically right now we're at the start of the curation-based economic cultural system. Search is over, curation has begun. So big claim. And what we want to do, I think, today is just go right down the middle of this, right? We don't want to trivialize it, and we don't want to think it's everything, but we do want to find a perhaps comfortable way that we can see it as important to our own work. I'm partly interested in curation, honestly, as Nicole was saying, because I'm from New Orleans, and it's sort of a constant act of collective curation all the time. And it's actually one of the fun things about living here is it really is a sort of gigantic project that we're all working on together that lives through time and has subtle little changes, but is also incredibly rooted in tradition. As visitors, you experience some of this food and drink, and if you're here at the right time, parades, things like that. But you live here, you start to realize it's really a kind of deeper and more interesting thing, including the curation of time. In many places, this is kind of the doldrums of winter that we're in right now, but here we're just gearing up towards the festival season that extends through Mardi Gras really all the way to Jazz Fest, only ending with the great malaise of summer. It's an important time here. We also curate a really unique way of speaking, and I suppose the characteristic example that lots of people know is the expression, where you at, which sort of means, how are you, how's your mama, rest of the family, what have you done today, and most notably probably, where have you had lunch, and sort of compacts that into one expression, and of course it can be answered in all kinds of different ways. So if we are somewhat stuck as humans with this idea of collective curation, I'm hoping you were thinking of your own examples from where you live or other things about in your life where this starts to have an impact. I know many of you are from Chicago, where Cavio is, and it's a very curated place in a totally different way, and it's one of the remarkable things about it. So if we're a bit stuck curating, why not bring it to L&D and think about how the things that we work on, our library, our curriculum, even an individual course, can be curated as well. So let's look at that a little bit. Here's a stock kind of concept about curation in the age of social media. It actually comes from Shutterstock, so it's a stock graphic too, right? But it's also just a very sort of stereotypical, it's a kind of interesting concept. And of course, we do this sort of thing all the time with social media, probably especially, where we find something and we add it to something we're kind of building, like our social media, and then we share it out to the world so that everybody who's connected to us can see it. And, in our culture, people do this many millions of times a day. So it's become a really integrated part of who we are as people. And it's one of the fundamental acts, it seems, of how we live our lives. But it's also sort of shallow. As everybody's doing it, how much thought is given to it? Let's see if we can get beyond it. So one way to get down into some deeper level of things generally is to look at etymology. So curate actually comes from Latin, and this word cura is the root. It's really interesting because when you speak about medical cures, that actually comes from a different root. It's sort of surprising, but true. This word cura has a lot more to do with kind of a spiritual oversight or care, and a kind of charge we've been given to have a spiritual oversight of others. So, for instance, the word curate is used to designate a type of parish priest comes right from this. You may think, oh yeah, I've heard that before. With Robert Smith here at left, I'm hoping this definition, as he would put it, means that this word curate is stranger than I thought. What are we caring for? If we're curators as kind of caretakers, caregivers, what do we care for? Well, we're caring for a lot of objects, learning objects, courses, etc. We're caring for people, learners, other stakeholders within our organization, right? We're really trying to enact some important changes in their lives, in building their knowledge base, their skill set, even creating a different mindset or helping them to find it. That's part of our value to the organization. We're also caring for its culture, right? Trying to, as we always do, trying to craft the whole organization as a learning organization, right? So it really becomes a kind of cultural solution, and everything around us is our ally in helping us do great L&D. I'd like to also suggest that we're really curating a process of change. And I think the more we can really grasp that and think about it, the better off we are. And I believe that becomes an important master term in our lives. Curation, let's say, creates cohesive meaning experiences from discrete elements. And of course, classically, that's what it does. If you think about a gallery exhibit, for instance, that you've seen, a curator may have selected items made by different artists, even in different periods, but grouping it around a theme, right? Or you maybe just a period of expression from one particular artist that's been brought to the forefront from a great body of work, right? But we're looking for commonality. Learning, too, fosters cultural cohesion to strategically address the business case. What kind of cohesion are we trying to get? And that's an open question as we go further. But generally, we're stuck over to the left. We own a lot of courses. When we're trying to be productive, it often means we're developing courses at a highly productive rate. So there's more and more. And even in my own life, it's like that. There are many clients, many projects, we're working and working. And that's great. It's good to be that way. It certainly shouldn't be criticized, but it can be complemented by moving over here to the right into the yellow space, where all our learning is interrelated. It has a message, which is sometimes hard to see, but what is the message overall that all the learning you're working on or all the learning within your organization is trying to convey? We develop with a purpose that's aligned with that message. We're trying hard to get that message across, and we keep working on the core in order to do that. Curation tends to be, I think, over on the right side, but the interesting thing is if we start to try to harder and more reflectively to try to curate the things that we're doing, it may be a good way to make the leap over to that right side and dwell there for a while too. So what's a core? This is something that even after I presented, and it's somewhat frustrating to me, but pretty revealing. People have said to me, well, yeah, but what do you mean when you talk about the core? So I've really tried to come up with different ways to explain it, but I think one good way is just to cite an interesting kind of master example that I'll go back to a few times during this presentation. So we have a client that's an engineering firm that works in the energy sector. And when I first started to work with them, I was very fortunate in this regard, in that I had some people who worked there, one person in particular, tell me, this is what you have to understand about this company. It is not a process-based company. It's not even really a production-based company. It is a decision-driven company, and everything we do has to do with making the right decisions. And it's true, even a lot of our course development is aligned with the decision-making process with review boards, things like that. It's really fascinating. But their company culture really reflects this. So when they pursue a project, when they're working at the project, they have an interdisciplinary team gathered together. They're getting the best data they can, ranging at times from lab data to mathematical modeling to some really interesting computer simulations with some proprietary software that they have. It's remarkable stuff. They have a very structured process for making decisions with checkpoints all along the way, different people involved at different times. It's elaborate and interesting. And then also they employ people who are professional decision analysts who are working with these teams to try to make the right decisions. And then when they do a look back review, a lot of times these people are leading it to try to see where things went right, where things went wrong. It's not so much how efficient we were, how much money we made. A lot of it is what was the quality of our decisions and what can we learn from that. So this is a company that has a pretty strongly articulated core, probably unusually so. When I ask people about the core, I found that I tend to get different responses, but I've kind of grouped a few of the most interesting ones into a few nodes here. A Jeff Carpenter-esque response would be, well, it's our curricular, the core is our curricular response to the business case. We understand what the business needs to do, where its shortcomings may be, what its aspirations are, and we're trying to help with all that through learning. A few people have told me in one way or another, either using this terminology directly or something very allied, that it really comes from the founding of the company or it's sort of revamping through a kind of blue ocean approach where you leave the red shark-infested waters and head off towards a point where there's no competitors because you're doing things so differently. So learning becomes in service of that approach. How do we get people to even understand it? Even if we hire people from our closest competitors, they don't necessarily get that because we're doing things on purpose that are really different here. So learning's got to facilitate that kind of transformation. Over on the left side, we have a few examples of what I hear that are perhaps a little more negative. One is, you know what the core is? It's what those new people just never get. They don't really understand what it means to work here. Well, you know, part of that is kind of probably truthful bias, saying that the people who were at the company at the beginning have a certain insight into its purpose, into its uniqueness, into its nature, right? But there's a double-edged meaning with get there. The new people might not get it, but they're also really not receiving it, and that we may not be articulating very well for them what it means to work here and why it's different and interesting. And that's where L&D, of course, can step in. Another one that's very, very common and probably sort of dangerous in some ways is, oh, we've got a core, right? But it's new every year. It's like the leadership team's always evolving, revolving, and it's always changing. So every year they're kind of wiping out what we did before and telling us what we're going to do now. And there's, of course, a lot of work in that for L&D professionals, but it can be super frustrating. Another approach to the core that many of you, I think, in our audience probably have started to use or are using, it's using this concept of reusable learning objects. It's become kind of a big deal in our industry, but it speaks to the core in an interesting way if you do it well. So reusable learning objects, basically the idea is to find a few things to curate that are going to show up various places in your curriculum and to do a good job of creating them, managing them, deploying them in the right places. You don't want to seem just redundant, so they have to be recontextualized so it becomes kind of rich, but the elements themselves become sort of treasured objects. You have to, at times, for bigger companies especially, build governance around them so you can articulate when you want to change them or how they should be reviewed. And then learning content management systems, of course, are like a technology for deploying these LOs across curricula and media so that you can send them out through e-learning, in the PowerPoint decks, in the manuals. Really interesting stuff, and the technology for it's like vastly cool. And Kevio, one of the things we do is, you know, it's sort of part of our consulting approach is we actually help people with things like this, like just do it well. We've sort of studied on it, we're experienced in it. So, for instance, we have learning resources just about writing for our LOs, and also other ones about governance, things like that. So we try to address these issues that are arising with our clients. Here's a good way to get involved a little bit more here, that you listen. Can you use this idea of reuse, especially if you're not using it now? It's sort of an interesting idea, and I can tell you others are. If you had to make reusable components for your learning, the stuff that you're there working with all the time, what would they be? Can you list 5? And now let's think about the core again. You've seen a few examples now, and a few different ways to approach it. How would you approach it? Like, is your core of your organization values? Is it a brand, an idea? Just the people who work there? Is it some special mindset that they have? What sets it apart? And do you try to convey that in learning? You know, what I find is talking to people, we so often use content as the occasion to create learning objects that we sort of miss this. It's like, yeah, I know what the company's about, and I think we all kind of do, but we never actually articulate that in anything, except the onboarding, of course. Well, we have the onboarding. You know, part of this is just trying to get well past that and think about how to disseminate the core everywhere, right? And also another part of it is distilling it a little more. It's, again, Jeff Carpenter approach. It says the one-page guide for L&D leaders and working with others in the organization. It's a little different approach, but if you only had one message to give to your learners, what would it be? So it's, even if you're doing a lot of some reuse-based learning, can you distill it even further so it's just one thing? In effect, can you do what my client did for me when I started working with a decision-based company? Can you say, here's the thing about this company, and say it in a sentence? So the origin story is often a really powerful way of shaping a culture, right? And you may find that in your organization, that's still a really important part of your core, where you came from and why, right? I'd like to tell a story now a little bit about one of our other clients. This is a company that works with waste and very oriented towards environmentally sound ways to do that. So we did a program for them, a course for them called Day in the Life of the Driver. It's video enhanced e-learning. We shot out in Arizona. Originally, it was supposed to be a course just for their customer service representatives. The idea was, how much do these folks really know about what the drivers do all day? So we're telling customers things, but are we telling them things that the drivers actually can do? What impact do our messages actually have on the drivers' lives? And initially, people have been taking drive-alongs with the drivers, but for various reasons, which you can pretty easily imagine, that just became really impractical. So we were charged with just making something pretty realistic about what it was like to be a driver for this company, and looking at different lines of business and different types of trucks and different types of routes. It was really interesting stuff. And we had video of the drivers and of the trucks and the problems they encountered, and we had some we had interactive elements like this cool interactive map where you could go to different stops. We actually had several of these from the learner's perspective involved. And then we had some even more interesting stuff in some ways, like we had driving simulations. This one you just had a lot of obstacles coming at you. You can see just from a design standpoint, we kind of ran with the desert idea, so everything kind of looks like a Roadrunner cartoon. And this was super fun to make, but what we really found about it that was the fascinating part is we started off with this one purpose in mind and this one audience, and we realized just because of the nature of the company we were talking about, and more that we found, we were really talking about their culture. And that's what the object of studying this program really is. It's like, what sets these people doing this kind of work apart, and what makes them able to do it at a high rate of success? And we found that there is like an amazing quality of resilience among these drivers. You know, they were doing the kind of work that honestly most of us don't want to do. And they were doing it at a very high level, doing it arduously throughout the day. I mean, it's just, these routes are not easy to enact, right? They were doing it with an amazing amount of esprit de corps, collegiality. They were obviously having a lot of fun, which was pretty interesting to see. And we found that this was really just true of their company. They had a very strong sense of their role in society, and they articulated that really well. So we made this course, and we found that it is one of those things that went out there and lived in the world and did all kinds of interesting work on its own. So the people we made it for really liked it. It started with one audience, and now all of our clients' employees view it. They run the video on the YouTube channel so other people can access it too. And now we're making a Day in the Life series because different employee groups wanted to have one of their own. So in fact, we're working on the Day in the Life of the dispatchers right now. And I think that's interesting because we really felt like it's partly cultural reflection. We were giving them back what we saw, but also some of its culture building, giving them a stronger sense of unity, a stronger sense of pride, a feeling of appreciation for each other. And it was like one of the more gratifying things I've worked on lately. So a good question for you all is, when you think again about core, what's your culture? Does the learning that you're working on foster it? Does it show up in a core? How should it show up? How does learning enact or represent or build a culture? You know, one thing I could say as an ID, that I've learned in the last few years especially is almost any course I'm assigned is actually an opportunity to do this. The more you find out about the client, the more you can see that there's a way in which you can get past the content while still honoring it completely, but build in a kind of richness at the edge that really speaks to the culture and the special place and special people who are receiving this learning and working with you on it. So another question is, what do your learners experience? Left to right. You know, a lot of times we're over here on the left side, and probably justly so. I mean, it's like we're trying to use these different media. They're very interesting. We're trying to also just use live presence in all kinds of new ways that make sense, right? Guided experiences, things like that. We're trying to even steal some things from higher education. You see, you know, advising as being the real key to retention, and trying to build in advising centers in our corporate universities. But a whole other question is, how do our learners really experience what we'd like them to experience? So there's many ways to address this. I'll just talk about one. I think the narrative is just a really powerful tool to get a deeper buy-in. And as much as we may be telling one story through our core, there's many opportunities to tell interrelated kind of micro stories that fit it. So I'll try to give you a brief example. Here are comic book heroes from the same company that I started with, our decision-based engineering firm. And this is from an e-clip that we made that was trying to solve a particular problem. People working alone don't always do what we'd like them to do. Sometimes they take shortcuts. No one's watching. Probably no one will ever find out. How do you get them to embody what the company really wants from them when there isn't anybody there to bother them about it? So we have a scenario here. Our man Jason is on a lonely installation. He's discovered a leaking flange. And it's a pretty small incident. It's not a complete environmental disaster. He can fix it. He can probably fix it in 5 or 10 minutes. He's got the tools. What would you do? But he's under this, but let me say, he's also supposed to report it. And there's lots of reasons for that, right? Some of it's internal. We want to do an investigation at every incident to see why this happened, get to the root cause. We may find, too, that we just have a lot of flanges that leak. We'd like to start figuring that out, but why that's happening and if we need to replace them more often, et cetera. But it's hard to know that if we just can't even get a count of them. The core tenets of the company speak. Again, it's a decision-based company. That's at a big level. Let's make the right decisions about how we advance a project. It's also at the micro level. We'd like you to make the right decision every day using the mindset the company's trying to help you to get and apply. So what would you do? Would you report or not? And what we were trying to do here, after talking a lot to the people on site, was just get beyond the supervisor's nagging voice. So we tried to create your own sort of voice of conscience in a kind of alternative way through fiction. But a good question for you is, what story is at your core? And also, how can you tell it? Like, here's an example. If you think about a decision-based culture, well, the engineers get that because they're part of this decision-making process. But the people in the field, it's maybe a little bit trickier. They may feel a little bit more removed from it. But you can build in stories about their decisions, honestly, pretty easily. And sometimes, as part of our eClip branding here, Captain Birdie, who's our host of our eClip series, says, sometimes a slight removal from reality can make the message all the more real. We talked about culture and experience. Let's talk a little bit about the ecosystem. This is a little different from the other nodes I've covered so far because in part it has to do more with the structure of the learning organization and the L&D organization. It's not entirely about content or approaches to content or messaging. Some of it's about just building capacity and making some of these other things come to life. How can you build capacity towards having a more articulated core that lives more places in the culture and is curated by more people with a stronger sense of purpose? So we think about a web of learning life. Again, a series of questions. Some may appeal to you more than others, but they're sort of interesting, at least for me, to think about. Do our SMEs actually know about us having a core, or do they know what's in it? Or are we just charging them with developing some content? Or are we talking to them about some other issues too? As I was trying to explain a minute ago, IDs have wonderful opportunities to build culture along with content all the time. Just have to almost be turned loose to do it and encouraged and understand a little bit of what the culture is that we're trying to reflect in learning. So what repeats? What are the motifs? How can you get people to access this core in a way that makes sense. Do the learners actually change? How do we know that? What kind of data are we using to feed the process? And is the learning aligned with business value? And how and in whose eyes? We may think it's true, but does anyone else think so? When we're trying to build a learning organization, we're really trying to build a kind of internal capacity where everybody understands that they're part of this and can contribute to it kind of consciously, right? It's not just latent in their lives. A good tool for this, and this is probably a somewhat unusual take on this item, is a learning record store. It's a kind of newer way of gathering learning records, learning data. It allows us to value more learning experiences beyond what an LMS can do. But if done well, it's really a great chance, a kind of invitation towards cultural change, because it's like a sort of little monster turned on the world, or a kind of secret agent. It puts the learner more in charge of their own learning. It can create a sort of expectation where many things they go through in their professional lives are, in fact, partly about learning. So it's easier to craft a learning-oriented mindset with a tool like this. And then it also creates a new horizon of expectation for people in L&D. Because if our learners actually are somewhat in charge of this process, and if the theory of it is many things are learning, many things count, then we're under some pressure to provide those things, work with those things, validate those items, right? And also to help articulate paths by which they start to cohere, right? How do we want people to proceed in this rich world of learning? So we have to deliver, and we have to help integrate. If you think, I just can't make much impact on my learning ecosystem, well, sometimes I'm not a huge believer in just the trying to see technology as the constant solution to things. But I have seen examples where these learning record stores just can become a really powerful avenue for cultural change. They also can be, of course, almost completely unused after they are acquired, because no one's really doing what these things are set up to help us do. So we've looked at the core as a story, as a culture, a series of reusable learning objects. We talked about how people experience it. We talked about how to craft an ecosystem towards sustaining it or helping it to thrive. I think probably this idea of seeking change is in some ways really the most important and probably the hardest one to get to too. I'd like to think that if we do it well, it'll make all the other nodes easier on us to realize. It'll start to make everything fall into this cohesive pattern that we're chasing. There's probably, if you think about the core as change, there's probably really two sides to this. And I suppose they're quite interrelated, or at least parallel to. We can think of the core as being changed. In other words, the core changes people and builds a culture. So we can think of it as a way of doing a kind of perpetual bridging of gaps. People come to us this way, and we want them to be able to do these things and think this way, because it's going to help our organization to succeed, and it's going to help them too within this organization and probably in other walks of life too. So we're trying to help them to change. The other side is the core also must change, but we have to avoid that winds of change approach I was talking about earlier. Right? It's got to be kind of a managed, structured change fed by data and is being made for a reason. But it's maybe more of an evolution sometimes than a revolution, but the core needs to change with the culture, the market, the world. There's new opportunities. I think a lot of times people who do this kind of work well, they have a core where there's parts that are kind of enduring, and there's aspects that also change in application or even in definition. Let's say you're the architect who's charged with building on to live. It's a pretty interesting proposition. What could you possibly do to live up to what's staring at you there? What could you build over here? And of course, what the architect did was, one way to think of it is going vertical, right? It's like, okay, the Louvre contains the history of art, of human expression, right? Examples thereof, highly curated, beautifully wonderful. Like even the lighting in the place is great, and the way it interacts with the art, awesome. Okay, I'm going to do this same thing. I'm going to contain the history of art too in a totally different way. It's going to go back far beyond the building that is the Louvre to ancient Egypt, and it's going to go all the way up vertically to where we are today in postmodernism. It's going to be something that can sit there next to the Louvre, and they can kind of nod back and forth to each other. And we can imagine that there's tension there. We can imagine it's friendship and collegiality. Hard to know. Okay, let's talk about how that might play out in an organization. So the decision-based organization uncovered something really interesting. And this is one of those things where it's like the world gets the best of us and doesn't always relent to our own viewpoints. So they discovered that the world was a highly, highly, highly uncertain place. And what's interesting is, well, of course they knew that, but they found that their decision-making process, good as it was, structured as it was, clear as it was like actually kind of blinding them to this. They had a lot of faith in the process, and then they ended up in looking at an analysis after the fact, thinking, well, yeah, we could have done better. I mean, it's like we made good decisions, but things happened that we didn't really see, that we couldn't really account for. So what they decided to do, and this was, again, a very conscious effort, and it was really fascinating, I'm still part of it, they decided they would build a kind of complementarity into their core. So if the core is decision-making, then the complement that deepens it is going to be uncertainty. And now when we design courses for them, we always put in a component of uncertainty. Uncertainty analysis, how do you quantify it? How do you identify it? Where does it show up? What are the greatest risks? You can think about risk, consequence, and likelihood tables all playing into this, and they do. And the thing that's really interesting, too, is this is a very conscious effort. In other words, when we take a course back to a review board, it's almost always this comes up. So where's the uncertainty? It's got to be there because it shows up everywhere in all the work we do. Even in the far-flung parts of their content, esoteric courses for computer scientists or engineers, they're still creating this kind of ongoing uncertainty analysis, and their professional class people are really re-educating themselves in this manner on this topic all the time. So this is an example of how a core can evolve. You're taking one concept, and in this case, finding something that's nearly its opposite, right? And then finding the point at which they connect. How can we make the best decisions given all these uncertainties? And how can we identify and analyze these uncertainties so that we can make the right decisions? This is kind of like a multiple choice list, but you can have any of them, all of them, none of them. So think about where you reside after listening to me speaking and thinking alongside me for today. We need a core. Now that could be like a question. We need a core, or it can be an exclamation point. You know, it's interesting you're saying all that because I swear we don't have anything like that. You know, and I think that happens a lot. It becomes the thing that should be closest to us, but it often is completely missed. Well, we have a core, all right, but we haven't done much with it as far as learning, except maybe onboarding, of course, right? But how can we add to that? You may think the reusable learning stuff, now I'm down with that. I'm actually working on that. Right now, we have a team gathering the reusable elements. So you can feel good that you found a great way into this question of the core, and you found some objects to curate and care for. They're going to be important moving forward. You may think that just right now, you finally found the story that you want to compose. It's going to be at the heart of things. And sometimes that comes to us and is given to us, and sometimes we have to try to craft it and find it for ourselves. I think the next point is really a big one for people, which is trying to get beyond content to build culture. And this is something that if I was to suggest a takeaway to you for today, I might point to this one. You know, you can bring this up as a problem to your whole team at your next meeting. Like, we always talk about content, but can we take the things we're doing right now, building content, to actually strengthen our culture too? Can these two things work right alongside each other without missing the content at all? We have a core, but now we need the cure. Like, we have a core, but it just kind of lays there. It's sad because it should be a lot more dynamic. So how can we do that? And how can we make it mean more for people? So a few more takeaways. In Louisiana, of course, another big term we have that you probably know is lagniappe, which is like a little bit extra. So I was talking about how I thought that cure song 6 different ways actually showed up here, and I think I had 5. I had the reusable learning objects as core. Those 4 nodes, that makes 5. Another one that I didn't really cover, that's probably a topic of a whole different presentation, is reconciliation. Can the core be the place where all these competing interests in your business and your organization come together? Can you bring people together through trying to make a common core? I don't know if you know this, but in New Orleans culture, the oyster po' boy is known as the peacemaker. You know, partly because I think when you bring it out, we just all want to eat it. Nobody wants to fight anymore, right? But it's also considered like the gift of peace. Like, let's not fight. Curation is an act of building culture and sustaining an ecosystem. It's something that enriches us all, builds capacity, makes things work for us a little bit better. And it all begins with this idea, beyond just selection, of caring for things, caring for people, right? Trying to take things to a deeper level of meaning, too. I think that's one thing that's important in all this, is find the richness at the edge of what you're doing and just push through it a little further. All right, I'll try to do this first one. At the beginning, you said your presentation aligned with Jeff's on the one-page for L&D. Could you speak specifically to that? Yeah, it's aligned in that Jeff's basic principle has to do with the value of learning development and showing that to people and making it a much more central part of the organization. And what I'd like to do is just, you can imagine this almost like layers or a spectrum, right? I'm adding a layer here that's just about content, messaging, and the way in which learning is changed, added right next to that, right above it. So as we try to make value from L&D, the way we do that is to try to execute a really great core that speaks right to the heart of the organization. I'm a bit unclear as to what a core is. Can you give me just one definition? It's the heart of your learning that everyone at your organization experiences that changes their lives forever. So even when they leave, it's what they take with them, right? And it's what the gift your organization has to bring into the lives of those people. Oh, yeah, reusable. Someone says, I'm not familiar with the term reusable learning objects. Where can I find more about this topic? So there's been a good amount of talk about it in the industry. One approach I would suggest is there's some people who actually do this really centrally, who make those kind of knowledge content management systems I was showing. Xyleme's one, Xyleme. There's people in those organizations. That's a great place to start because they can show you how those objects work, and they can show you the system that operates with them to help you deploy them most efficiently. What would you recommend how we can present this concept of leadership and SMEs? You know, I think with the SMEs, one thing to ask them is kind of group them together. Just ask them what they think your core is. And my experience with SMEs is, obviously, they're usually pretty accomplished people and they have an opinion. So even if you've never even approached this with them, I think just having almost like a panel discussion with them, you say, what do you think the core of our learning should be in this organization? And it might be a really good learning experience for you as well as for them, right? And I think it's sort of with leadership, it's kind of the same thing. You have people who, they kind of know the answer to this, actually. It's sort of like if you approach them and say, what do you think our core, we want to have a core. We want to have a core that everything sort of revolves around. Instead of just like a list or a catalog, we want to have a circle and things that radiate off of it. What's in there? And I think your leadership a lot of times is going to have a really strong answer to that because they sort of live in that world quite a bit, right? They're often having to explain the company to other people.
Curation seems like content management with a little art thrown in. What more is there to it?
That's an excellent definition. Thank you. I'll use that. So yeah, it's like if you come from we used to call this content management quite a bit, and it is like that. It really is. I suppose one thing that's different, the way I'm trying to use the term, is it's more of a cultural solution, right? It's less something that L&D, at least my version of content management was, it's things that we apply to the areas that are our own province. I'm sort of suggesting turning that inside out and saying what is the common collection that's everybody's province. Maybe that's a kind of complementarity within it. It's not so different from content management, but if we just take the sort of opposite of the somewhat narrow definition of content management I've given, and we throw the opposite into it, then we probably get to a deeper sense of what would be ideal to have happen here.
How about some practical advice on making and sustaining a core in learning?
Well, I think the practical advice is probably just to make this a common question for all your team members. How can it be done, right? And you have to look at where you're at now, right? And start with that. Do we have a core? What is it? And how can it best be conveyed too? Are we doing a good enough job with our various media? Is it really experiential enough? And I think that's a really important question. And also another big one is just, where does it live? And that may be a great place to start for a lot of organizations.